Matthew chapter 18, verses 15. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church, and if he refuses to listen, even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything you will ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three come together in my name, there am I with them.
Good morning, True Direction. Now, you've just heard Lolly reading a passage from the Bible, which in my Bible is headed, A Brother Who Sins Against You. Now, when I first read this passage, the only thing I sort of got from it was it seemed to be Jesus' teaching on conflict resolution, which is rather a fancy way of saying how to resolve arguments. But there's a little more in it than that, which I sort of came to realise quite quickly. But if you look at it on the surface, it starts out, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault. Now, obviously by brother it doesn't mean a specific sibling who happens to be male, who is, born to your same parents. It actually just means someone else from the church, or if you like, someone else from your class at school, or just possibly just someone you know. Now, for them to sin against you, it would mean that they would do something that would annoy you. Now, I've tried to think of different things people might do that might annoy you, and I thought sometimes people call you a name you don't like. Now, I've always been rather fortunate with this. I've literally just been mostly called Tom most of my life, and when I was younger I was called Tommy, but that's what I called myself, so that was also fine. People have come up with nicknames for me, which they've just generally not used and just carried on calling me Tom, despite the fact they told me they've come up with a good nickname for me. So I don't have a lot of experience in this, but I do know a friend of mine who we were in a sort of group which texts to each other, and someone else in the group, when they texted him, they spelt his name wrong. And this really annoyed him. But instead of going to the person and saying, and just replying immediately back saying, actually, my name's spelt this way, he just got slowly more and more annoyed about it. And then as he got more and more annoyed, he actually eventually moaned to me that someone else spelt his name wrong. And I was like, well, did you not ought to just mention it to them? And then they probably won't do it anymore, because I honestly don't think they're doing it to wind you up. I think they honestly now, after this much time, think that's how your name's spelled. Anyway, a little more time passed, and then he moaned at it to me again. It was like, by this point, he was really quite angry. And I thought, well, I can't just let this carry on. So I thought, well, right, I will mention it to him then, and see what happens. So I mentioned it to this other guy, and he said, "Oh, I didn't realise. I thought it was just spelled that way. Some people do spell it that way." And I was like, "Yes, but he doesn't, and it really annoys him." He was like, "Oh, fair enough then," and that was it. From that moment forth, he always spelt his name correctly in our little texting group, and the other person then no longer had this to moan about. Now sometimes this was just an unfortunate incident with an incorrect spelling, but my point here is that this guy who had his name spelt wrong and got really angry about it, if he'd just dealt with it as Jesus sort of suggested we deal with these things, that would have been completely finished before he'd had a chance to get upset by it. Anyway, that's one example. You might also you might have a friend who borrows your pencils and always gives them back to you blunt. Now, if this annoys you, then you should just mention it to them and say, look, would you mind just sharpening the pencils before you give them back? And you might find that this person has been previously asked by someone else whose pencils they've borrowed not to sharpen them, because especially coloured pencils, you can end up losing half the pencil if you're not very good at it, and just because the lead just keeps breaking every time you do it, and by the time they get the pencil back, you've got half a pencil. So they might have been previously asked not to, and they might not realise that that's not how you want it done. But in this passage, it specifically says, if your brother sins against you, and apparently in some manuscripts it doesn't even say against you. So then we're looking at, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault. Now this brother, we're actually sort of thinking of, they were calling themselves brothers in Christ. This was like the early church and people who were trying to be like Jesus. So if your brother sins against you, or rather, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault, this is actually saying, look, we're the church, and if you spot someone else in a church who is not really doing things correctly, they're doing what's called sinning. Sin, by the way, it just means not quite doing things right. It doesn't mean specifically doing things bad, it means not doing things right. So the way it's designed here is that if someone, say, I had a friend when I was a child, I went to the shops and with this friend, and while I was in the shops, this friend decided to swipe some shoelaces from the shelf and just put them in their pocket, and then go to the till having bought some sweets and leave the shop. And I was like, well, why? I was completely flummoxed by this. The idea that I could be friends with someone who would do such a thing was just so completely alien to me, having been brought up Christian, that I was just deeply shocked and didn't know what to do. And because I was so deeply shocked by it, I ended up just leaving the shop with them and not saying anything, and just making up my mind never to enter a shop with that person ever again. If it happened to me now, being more grown up and used to the fact that, yes, some people just do this for the thrill, because at the end of the day, what they took, as far as I'm aware, they didn't even want. If I was with someone these days who did that, I would immediately just say to them, put that back. And I would say it to them that quietly and, trying not to make a scene, as I say, put that back. And if they just looked at me like quizzically, I'd say, now. And if they didn't put it back, I'd say, look, I'm asking you quietly. I'm going to just keep asking you more loudly until people start turning around, put it back. And that is how I would deal with it if it happened today. As I say, when I was a small child, that's not how I dealt with it. But the idea being that initially, if you spot someone doing something wrong and they immediately just agree with you, yeah, you're right, this is wrong, and undo it, then case closed. It's over. It doesn't matter. They strayed a little bit. You've pulled them back onto the right track, and it's done. Nobody else needs to know about this. It's over with. You've sorted it all out. It's completely over. However, if you try quietly to correct someone and they don't want to be corrected, then the next stage is that you start drawing the attention of other people and saying, look, me and these other people who are now aware of this all agree what you're doing is not quite correct. And then when they see that more people are aware of this and that everybody's agreed that what you're doing is not correct, they may then think, you know what, no, it isn't. It's not correct. I will stop it now. And again, if that is then over, then case closed, that nothing else needs to be said. But if this person then still persists in saying, no, I would really like to steal from this shop, then it would be unfortunate that they may no longer be your friend after this. But if the shop then became aware that this person was stealing from the shop and decided to then hold them in a room until such time as the police could come and prosecute them for this, then your friend has been rather silly in that they just didn't just give this up. And also, this is the correct thing. If someone's done something wrong, then, and they really don't think it's wrong, or they just, they decided that they are definitely, no, I'm definitely going to do this wrong, then unfortunately that person does need to suffer the consequences of what they've done wrong, because it's wrong. So, as I say, that is how I would deal with that situation if it ever came up now. Now, the other thing you need to point out here is this is if your brother sins against you, this is a Christian bunch basically trying to keep each other on the straight and narrow. Christian, the actual name Christian, was actually a nickname given to people who followed Jesus' teaching, because Jesus was known as Christ, and they said, these people are trying to be like Christ. Let's call them Christians. And they just said, that's a fantastic name, thank you. Which is how we sort of came to be known as Christians. Now, Christians, elsewhere in the Bible, it said, were recognised by their love for each other. Now, if someone loves you and you have a problem with something they do to you, and you mention it to them and say, look, I don't like it when you do this, if they love you, they'll say, fine, I won't do it again then, because I know you don't like it. And that, again, immediately, that is completely resolved. However, it says if someone, even after you've gone to the head of the church and said, look, this person is doing this, there's 3 of us now have gone and spoken to them about it, and they're still doing it, and then the church leaders come and say, look, no, this is not how the church is supposed to operate, this is not how you work, and they still say it, then unfortunately that person, it says, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, a pagan is someone who doesn't believe in God at all, so you would basically treat them as someone who doesn't go to church. Now, if in this world, probably the best example to use would be adultery. Adultery is not against the law. It is against God's law, but it is not against the British law. So if someone outside the church wants to practice adultery, then you can tell them God doesn't like it, but if they don't believe in God, it's not really going to make any difference to them at all. However, if you tell someone who goes to church that they really didn't ought to be committing adultery, and then you get your minister to tell them, no, you really, really didn't ought to be committing adultery, and they carry on doing it, then you would just have to say to that person, look, if you're going to live like this, you're not welcome in our church, really, because you can't be setting this example to other people in the church. They see you doing it, they think, oh, it's fine then because they're doing it, and it's not fine. It's completely against God's teaching. And no way can you be teaching that this is okay. So this person, we would either end up making them feel unwelcome or unwanted, because you can stand in the pulpit and say, look, this is wrong. And if they want to sit there and say, no, it's not wrong, I'm going to carry on doing it, then I'm afraid they don't belong there. Because, we are supposed to live God's way. And if we're not going to do it, Jesus' teaching is not a buffet where you can just say, well, I don't like tomatoes, so I'm not going to eat them. Jesus' teaching is Jesus' teaching, and you need to take all of it. And if you're going to say to Jesus, well, I kept most of your laws, but I didn't like that one, when you die and meet Peter at the pearly gates, and he'll say, well, I'm sorry, but you're not going to get on in heaven because everyone else here does think that's right, and you don't fit. You don't fit in heaven if that's what you think. Now, I'm not saying that if you've done anything wrong that you're not going to get there, but if you've done anything wrong and you don't agree with Jesus about it being wrong, then you won't get there. If you agree with Jesus that what you did was wrong, then you will, because Jesus will forgive you. But if you don't agree, Jesus will say, well, you don't belong here, do you? And it's harsh, but that's how it goes. But always remember, Jesus will forgive you anything you've done wrong, anything at all, so long as you agree with him that it was wrong and that you're sorry.